Good morning. Hi, Jonathan. Good morning.
Professor Danilo.
Nice being here with you.
Thank you.
We've chatted a lot these days. I'm so glad, so happy to be your host here at Direito TV. You're the visiting professor. And thanks for the interview. And to start with, I would like, I would ask you if you could informally present yourself. Give us your present background, your present roles in academy. Please.
Yes, thank you. Well, first, thank you so much to yourself, Professor Danilo, for your hospitality. And I very much enjoyed my time at Direito GV. I came to know of Direito GV because of a couple of conferences I attended, where I met some of your colleagues, Mario and Gastes, and just was so impressed with the research emphasis here. At a law school that is relatively young, in comparative
really
terms, but making quite a large impact on the international scene.
Oh, that's great.
And also, obviously, in Brazil itself. So I've been far from disappointed. In fact, my expectations have been exceeded. And I've had a wonderful time. I've enjoyed teaching a class. The class, it's on comparative law and development in Brazil, India, and China, which is, of course, a very ambitious course. It does draw on my background, both in terms of work experience. I was at a globally oriented law school in Delhi, India for 3 years.
Jindal.
Jindal, exactly, Jindal Global Law School, where I was assistant dean for a couple of years and part of a center for studying global governance from a Global South perspective. Over that time, I started to compare, particularly India and China. I think India tends to compare itself with China, as do we all in terms of economies that are growing with some rapidity. So that's where the course originated from. I taught a similar course at Jindal, but it's been fun to try to compress it into 1 week, first of all, and to have students, both who are exchange students, students from the newly minted LLM program here at Direito GV.
Yeah, I could see that. You
met
a student you had already met in India.
That's exactly,
that was great.
And one of my former students, from India. Yeah. So it's even a couple of students from the economics department of the business school from FGV. So it's been a really interesting mix. I was telling Danilo I'm hoping to have a debate for tonight's class as the format. I'm drawing on all these backgrounds and experiences of the students.
Right.
So back to your question, I'm currently, after returning from India, I have a research position with the University of Florida. It's in the Levin College of Law. It's in Gainesville, Florida, a wonderful research institution. And on Monday, I start a second position, a dual position with the Florida Coastal School of Law, which is another young school that's very much up and coming and innovating in terms of curriculum and global focus. So I'm quite excited about those positions.
Great. Nice. And since we are talking about what you do and what you are,
yes,
I can say that we've chatted a lot during these last 3
I've
days.
thoroughly, yes.
Also, personal stuff. We are running parallel lives regarding little daughter matters.
That's right.
That's great to know that. And I could realize you've had, since you were born, quite an interesting life. I mean, always abroad. You've been to many different, you had long periods in many different countries.
Yes.
For family purposes and also for academic and research purposes. And
yes.
I told you, you could be considered a citizen of the world, practically.
Well, since we are brothers, you also will be.
Okay, thank you. And regarding this personal experience, being abroad,
yes,
being in so many different countries, having experienced the really different cultures, would you consider, we are getting later, some of the next questions will talk about your specific legal research, but before that, would you say that this personal background in some way, in any way, has influenced your interests regarding legal research? Did you drive your interests were in some way affected by this interesting personal life you had so far?
Yes, without a doubt.
Tell where have you been?
Sure. Well, yes, I grew up all over the place, as you mentioned. But professionally, I've spent time in South Africa and Australia and India, and now back to the U.S. I would describe its influence in terms of my research trajectory. I was originally a constitutional law scholar. I still am. It's in some ways my primary focus. But in spending time in Australia, where I taught comparative constitutional law, and then in India, where I taught both constitutional law and matters of law and political economy, I became more and more convinced that you can't think about constitutional law, particularly perhaps in an advanced emerging country, without thinking about the economic drivers that sort of create the context for growth, for political and social context and debates, which then inform constitutional law. In fact, one of my current papers seeks to understand the coupling of debates over structural economic issues, which are happening in the US, happening obviously in Brazil and India and China, with its impact on constitutional law through a variety of theoretical paradigms, as well as empirical analysis. So my research has been heavily informed by my experience as an international and comparative academic. I would say that opportunities in legal academia to travel and to conference and to spend substantial time overseas, as you know, Danilo, it's only increased in the last 10 or 20 years, and we are beneficiaries of that.
And me too.
Exactly, and I hesitate to call myself a comparativist because it's kind of a hubristic thing to say, right? To understand another context sufficiently to be able to pontificate about legal and social matters. But nonetheless, I think whether it's through the process of globalization or the realization in the US that we are no longer a hegemonic power, there are practical motivations for looking outside of our own borders and new opportunities for people like me and like yourself who, yourself spending time in Italy, PhD in Italy, and spending time in Germany and all over the world. Similarly, for myself, I've found that there are new opportunities. In the U.S., it's still the tectonic plates are still shifting. In fact, I'm teaching comparative law starting next week to U.S. students, and it's the first time that I've taught the course in the U.S. And I'm interested to see how open they will be to really exposing themselves to other systems. I have buffered myself against disappointment by really focusing on the practical benefits of comparative law, trying to convince them that there will be a time, no matter at what level you're practicing, there will be a time you will have to know about transnational aspects of contracts law,
That's mandatory nowadays.
Yeah, exactly.
That's mandatory nowadays.
It is. Yeah, extraterritorial law, comparative law, international law. It is part of the discourse, even in sort of everyday U.S. legal discourse now. So I'm really trying to emphasize that. However, having said that, it is refreshing to come to a place like Direito, which is in some ways premised on occupying the space in Brazil and occupying the space transnationally with Brazil's relationship with other parts of the world.
Great. Now, more precisely, let's turn to what you're specifically doing here in Brazil this week. More precisely, you're teaching a course titled Law and Development in Emerging Economies, comparing China, India, and Brazil.
Yes.
That's great. It sounds great how it's titled.
Yes.
I could see your first class. I was really interested on your approach.
Thank you.
But in general lines, regarding what you're teaching here this week as a visiting professor here at Direito, what's there to compare and contrast between these three countries, India, China, and Brazil? One could say there is to compare, but more precisely, in general lines, what's there to compare?
Yes.
And besides that, what's not to compare?
Yes.
What's not to compare between these three countries?
I think you have centered on the main point, really. I told the students yesterday that if there was one take-home message, it would be that each context is so singular, so different, so contrasting that there are innate pitfalls, there are problems in comparing them. So, I think you have to approach it with that understanding. And the contrast really, in my perspective, evolves from the pre-existing political and social history, right? Path dependency in economics. I mean, we're all familiar with that. And even though, and this is where I'm moving from the contrast to the comparison, even though arguably each of these three countries have embraced a fusion of state planning in terms of economic development with neoliberal private law principles, right? So you get what's very alternately called state capitalism or embedded autonomy, or you name it. There's many names in many contexts for it. Nonetheless, we've moved, as I explained in the first class, through roughly 3 to 4 eras in law and economic development, particularly in the context of what is very homogeneously called the Global South. So import substitution industrialization economies, Latin America very much part of that, India very much part of that, originally in the middle of the last century, to be followed by neoliberal economies, pushed by international financial institutions and U.S. Treasury, et cetera, and again Brazil and India, and to some extent China are very good examples of countries who've liberalized a great deal of their economies. However, none of these contexts can be called neoliberal in their function, because the state, to varying degrees and in various ways, retains control, whether it's through industrial policy, BNDES in Brazil, minority shareholder, the government being a minority shareholder in companies, or China, directly controls so many state-owned companies and has political influence on other sectors of the economy. India is another entity, separate but similar in some ways, where the government refused to liberalize across the board and started liberalizing sector by sector, protecting strategic and national champion sectors. So again, that idea of planning, industrial policy, the role of government in optimizing development, in contrast to what they're being told, or what the governments were told at the time by neoliberal economists, that you just throw your doors open and growth will come. So that's the one commonality, but the manifestation of each of these processes is incredibly different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Regarding what I've just said, I'll formulate what could be a tricky question, and I will immediately jump to the next question. Do you really think neoliberalism could be a common criteria to unify, to compare those three economies? That's kind of tricky. There would be a lot of space to discuss that. We could do later. And besides that, I did my homework. I've studied your papers, and I've noticed that you stress a lot what you call your expression, horizontal learning and experimentation as a developmental strategy. What does that mean? And besides, could you provide us with a specific example of horizontal learning as a developmental strategy?
Sure, both great questions. To go to your first point, it's a very informed one. I don't think that neoliberalism is a system that has been appropriated by each of the three countries. However, the role of privatization, private capital, and to some extent foreign investment in each context has been important. So it's almost like it's a buffet, and there's state control over here and planning and all that stuff, and then there's privatization, deregulation here, and there's a little bit of picking from both. And that's the only, as I see it, that's the only commonality.
I understand.
But each country has picked different parts, and exactly.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right on. There's no system anymore. The system is hybridization. Is fusion, confusion perhaps. And I think, I forget who exactly it was who said, perhaps Deng Xiaoping said, it's really about crossing the river and feeling out the stones as you go. I think in each context.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And regarding the expression horizontal learning, I liked that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's
explain
actually
us better.
To give full creddit. It's not my original term.
Yeah.
It's I think it was coined
you
by.
stress that expression.
Yes, no,
yeah.
absolutely. A number of scholars have used it. One who I was influenced by was David Trubeck, formerly of the University of Wisconsin School of Law, who is a great friend of Direito, I understand. However, the concept of horizontal learning is difficult to pin down, somewhat similar to state capitalism, because it hasn't really happened yet to any great degree of success. Now, I think in some ways it's a movement, it's a subaltern, perhaps not subaltern, but a movement to agitate or problematize the story of development where you'll take, say, antitrust law from the EU and put it in India, and that's what you do because developed countries have developed ideas about how law should function in development, and I think
that would be vertical.
Exactly, yes, exactly. Sort of a vertical globalization of law, and increasingly, there's an argument to be made that there's more to be learned from a peer country. If again you can say Brazil is a peer to India, or if you can say India is a peer to China. I mean, there are real problems with saying they are
could be
peer
considered
relationships.
competitors.
Exactly. Well, and that's problematic, and that's part of what a paper I'm writing with a couple of colleagues, one at the Wharton School, is writing about the role of nationalism and how it vies with the idea of horizontal learning and comparison and learning, from peers, whether it's India and China, which is what we're looking at. And specifically, not to get too into detail with this paper, but we're looking at India's attempt to use the Chinese model of special economic zones or bubbles for foreign investment, which failed rather spectacularly in India. India has many great qualities. I'm not criticizing the development as a whole, but this particular example of what could have been built horizontal learning did not work. And we're looking at some of the...
But the problem is not with horizontal learning.
Yes, arguably. It's very similar to the legal transplant dialogue where, you must focus on context and you must understand the social and political and economic context for a particular law or legislation before seeing whether it will apply in a very different context. So there are some similarities in that literature, but it's more a suggestion or an encouragement that the avenues for learning or thinking about appropriating development strategies be broadened. Everything, the most important activity will still happen within a particular country, right? Development happens relative to the economic and historical realities of a particular country. But if you are going to look outside, why not look at similarly economies with similar trajectories? Yeah, exactly.
Great. We are having a very informal and free chat here, and just to get to the end.
Yes.
Considering it's very informal, I'm asking you something that you can answer whatever you feel like to. But even if you're having a short stay in Brazil, here, a week overall.
Yes.
Did you find that's a touristic question? Did you have any special particular finding or impression regarding Brazil, even if you're here for just a week?
That's a very good question. I want to answer
just
it in two parts.
the interview.
I want to answer it in two parts. First is culturally, second is professionally. First of all, I'm a huge football fan, so I follow all the Brazilian team players that go over to Europe and achieve great success. So I'm looking forward to the World Cup. So I have watched Brazilian culture from afar. I've enjoyed it.
It's great you call it football, not soccer.
That's right. Yeah, I've enjoyed the little glimpses that I've seen. Obviously a vibrant place with an incredibly interesting history. Professionally, that has been the real benefit for me. I'm sure we will cross paths again and again, you and I, at least I hope. Similarly, the professors that I've had a chance to meet with, some new hires, Jedediah and Tiago, and I had dinner with Maria Lucia and Paulo last night, and just the hospitality, the vision, the excitement, the experience, professionalism has been entirely refreshing, and it has been a gift to me, you know, as I think about spending time in the U.S., but retaining my connections with other locations. So thank you very much.
I'm so glad. I thank you also for this interview and for
thank you so much.
The nice period we are having
it's been
here.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
So much, Professor. Yeah.
Thanks.
That's great.